Paul Morphy is likely the most talented chess player of all time. He learned to play at a young age watching his father and uncle play friendly games, and at the age of 12, he defeated the visiting master Lowenthal in a match. 1 year later, he played this brilliant game in which he defeated his father, not a bad chess player by any means, without his rook on a1. Needing to open the game aggressively to compensate for his sacrificed or offered rook, Paul Morphy begins with e4 and his father responds with e5. After knight f3, we enter the Italian game. Now, at this point, I would suggest that if you are trying to play against a player who is playing odds, you should probably pick less aggressive lines. Play very solidly and look to exchange pieces. You'll have the best chance of success. However, Alonso is no coward, and he's playing a friendly game against his son down a rook, so he does choose challenging lines, making the game more interesting. After knight to f6, knight g5 is the most natural response, attacking the weak f7 square, and Alonso knows the right counter, pawn to d5. Now, after pawn takes d5, he plays the most interesting move, knight takes d5, after which things get really sharp. However, a better move, especially when you're trying to defeat a player who is offering odds against you, is knight a5, and you should use this in your own games too if the opportunity arises. This is a theoretical line of the two knights variation of the Italian game, and after bishop b5 check and then pawn c6, I'm getting ahead of myself, and to trade, this bishop needs to retreat, and the game is interesting, and in this case, especially since white is playing without a rook, it's very much in black's favor. Black has sacrificed a pawn for some activity. Given that black is already up a rook, the loss of a pawn doesn't matter much, and gaining an activity at the cost of white having activity is exactly what you want. This is perfect. So after knight takes d5, the more interesting line, Paul Morphy naturally plays the fried liver attack. This attack sacrifices a piece to drag the black king into the middle of the board. This is a very famous line and it happens all the time among beginners. Even stronger probably is the move pawn to d4, although without the rook on a1, I think it's probably better to sacrifice the knight on f7 right away and get some chances to play against the exposed black king. However, this would be the better move, I believe, if you have a normal chess game. So after knight takes f7, king takes f7, queen to f3 check, the king is forced to go to e6. If he retreats anywhere else, the knight on d5 falls, and white is making progress. And if he picks the particularly horrible square back here, king to g8, then we are mating after this line here with a hilarious diagonal mate as the king is trapped by his own pieces. So instead, the king runs to e6 to defend the knight on d5, and now white's going to increase the pressure with knight to c3. So at this point, I would recommend that you play knight b4 in your own games. Knight e7 is also pretty good. Again, you probably will have the rook on a1, but if you get to this position with the rook on a1, which is very common, knight moves to defend the d5 knight are the way to go. Instead, Alonso tries knight d4 looking for counterplay. This makes the game very interesting, but it starts to make it risky for him as well. Bishop takes d5 check, and the king steps over to d6. I think the move we see right now is the first really nice move from Paul Morphy. He plays queen f7, sliding his queen in here and threatening a big mate. Do you see the mate? Knight to e4 on the move would checkmate the king, covering both the c5 square and giving a lethal check to the king on d6. So black needs to defend against that. We would not capture, for example, on c2 because after king d1, we still have this threat to deal with, mate, and we've got a loose knight, so we've only made our problems worse as black. Instead, after queen f7, a move like queen to e7 for black would be a successful defensive move, although I think maybe Paul could still create some tricks for his dad to fall into. At this point, bishop e6 is played, which is a very nice move in a lot of ways from Alonso, and it shows that he is a strong player in his own right. He's not just getting pushed around by Paul. Unfortunately, even though this move is very well intentioned, it's also a big mistake. The idea is that you're developing the bishop and forcing some exchanges. That's exactly what you want to do when you're under an attack. But chess is a concrete game, and the tactics do not support bringing this bishop out to e6. Now, after the trade on e6, white's knight hops into e4 with check. The king can only go to d5 if it's going to defend the knight on e6. And now we can play pawn to c4 check. The second excellent move, I think, after queen f7 from Paul Morphy. Again, to avoid the loss of the knight on e6 without any kind of compensation, we need to go ahead and take on e4, and then white's going to grab the knight on e6. At this point, black is still up a rook, but we don't need to be geniuses to go, this has gone really, really well for white. From an equal position at the beginning of the game where white is down a rook, now white is down a rook, and the black king is horrifically exposed on e4. Already black is probably lost in this position. The computer does suggest that maybe king d3 could hold on, with an idea to kind of stop the d-pawn from advancing and use the king to gum up the works for white. But after further thought, queen g4 looks to be winning. So I think at this point, the position is already objectively winning for Paul Morphy, and the question is simply, how is the game going to finish? So in this position with black to move, Alonso tries the move queen to d4, bringing his queen into the center of the board and hoping to use it to stymie white's checkmating attack. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. One brilliant move here is king e2 with huge threats like f3 check and then pawn to d3 with a discovered check. This would be very, very winning, but Paul Morphy finds a forcing way to finish the game. And I would suggest that you should play forcing continuations when you're attacking like this. They're simply easier to calculate. He plays queen g4 check. The king is forced into d3. Queen e2 check, forcing the king to c2. And now pawn d3 check, a beautiful discovered check, opening up the queen to attack the king. Now, at this point, Alonso essentially gave in right away and played the move king takes c1, allowing castles with checkmate. This is a beautiful, beautiful checkmate and a fantastic king hunt. There are very few games where, one, you get to castle and give checkmate, and two, the opposing king is driven all the way from one side of the board, the 8th rank, to, in this case, the 1st rank, and checkmated in a king hunt. I actually have a blog that you should check out that I'll put in the cards and comments to this video, listing as many games as I could think of where an opposing king was driven from one side of the board to the other before being checkmated. It's a beautiful collection. However, Alonso didn't have to allow quite this checkmate, and we should take a moment to say that after d3 check, he could have tried king b1, not capturing the bishop, but trying to use it as a shield to get away. The problem is that after castles, there's a tremendous set of bishop discoveries that are threatened. The king should try to run to a2 now, hoping to get out to b3 and dodge white's mating attack. Queen c2 is then the strongest move, and the threat is queen to a4 check, and then a bishop move with a winning discovery, a checkmating discovery. I think that my favorite defense that black might try is pawn to b5, covering the a4 square, so queen a4 check isn't available, but then we see that the king is still trapped. We can just play b3 check. With a beautiful echo of pawn d3 discovered check that we played earlier, now we have pawn b3 with discovered check. And after the king runs into the very corner of the board, even rarer than getting the king driven all the way from one rank to the other rank is driving the king to the very corner. Literally any bishop move that is not bishop b2 is checkmate in 1, and bishop b2 is checkmate in 2, so the game is very, very clearly over. I hope that you enjoyed this game between Paul Morphy and his father as much as I did. It is a beautiful game from an incredibly talented chess player, and it calls to mind for me the games that I played with my own father, and I suspect most of you learned to play playing against your father as well. So hopefully this brings up some good memories about games that you've played in the past against your father that may not have been this spectacular, but were still a lot of fun. If you like this video, check out my collection on brilliant chess miniatures and king hunts, and I hope to see you again in a future video.